Hello everyone, there are a lot of claims about the performance differences between 4S and 6S batteries, especially when it comes to FPV drones. So today we are going to be taking a look at these claims and seeing if they have any merit. Now the two biggest claims I see about the performance differences of 6S versus 4S are that 6S has better efficiency and 6S has better torque than 4S. And in my previous video, I actually debunked this using data from Mini-Quad Test Bench, and I showed that there are no significant differences between efficiency and torque. If you haven't watched that video, make sure to check it out. There's a lot of good information in there. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at some additional claims that have been made just generally on the internet and even specifically on my previous video. And these claims are that 6S has better flight time, 6S has reduced current draw, and that this reduced current draw is advantageous. 6S has significantly lower power losses in the wiring, and that 6S has better longevity, which means that you can put a lot more cycles on 6S compared to 4S before the batteries just can't provide enough power anymore. So before we get into the meat of this video, I want to get you guys thinking a little bit. So I have two batteries. One is a 4S 1300 milliamp hour battery, and one is a 2S 1300 milliamp hour battery. So I want you to think about these two questions. Do these two batteries contain the same amount of energy? And at the same current draw, will these two batteries provide the same amount of power? So keep in mind, they are the same exact capacity. So start thinking about those questions and let's get into the video. Okay, so let's start with the claims about flight time and battery longevity. So I think the issue here is that people are confusing capacity with energy stored. So capacity, which we measure in milliamp hours, that is a capacity, and that does not indicate how much energy is stored in the battery. Even though a lot of times we kind of think of it that way, that's only half of the equation. To get the actual energy that is stored in the battery, you have to multiply the amp hours of the battery times the voltage of the battery. So for example, with this 1300 milliamp hour 4S, we have to multiply 1300 milliamp hours, aka 1.3 amp hours times 14.8 volts, which gives us 19.24 watt hours. That is the energy stored in the battery, and that is actually what we care about when we're talking about flight time. Even though these two batteries have the same capacity in milliamp hours, they do not have the same energy stored. In fact, the 4S is about twice as big as the 2S and weighs twice as much, and it has twice the amount of energy stored in it because it has twice the voltage, twice the cells. So it intuitively makes sense. Capacity is not the same as energy stored, and don't just use milliamp hours when comparing across cell counts. So what I have here is a comparison between 4S milliamp hours and 6S milliamp hours while we hold the energy stored constant. So let's start off with the 1300 milliamp hour 4S. That has a stored energy of 19.24 watt hours, just like I discussed. The equivalent 6S battery that has the same energy stored only has a capacity in milliamp hours of 867. So even though the capacity is significantly lower, the stored energy will be the same because this 6S has two extra cells. A very common 6S battery size is a 1000 milliamp hour 6S. So that has a stored energy of 22.2 watt hours. The equivalent 4S battery is actually a 1500 milliamp hour 4S. And compared to a 1300 4S or a 867 6S, that is an increase of 15.4% in terms of energy stored. So even if you are comparing a 6S 1000 to a 4S 1300, it's not an apples to apples comparison because the 6S 1000 has an extra 15% energy stored. And since we know that there is no significant efficiency difference between 6S and 4S, we can translate this percentage into a flight time difference. So assuming that on a 4S 1300, like the one right here, we got about 3 minutes of flight time. If we went up to a 6S1000 or a 4S1500, all else being equal, we would expect almost a 30-second increase of flight time. So it's not the cell count that matters, it's the energy stored that matters. The 6S 1100 milliamp hour battery, this is what Mr. Steel uses. This has a 27% increase in energy stored compared to a 1300 4S. So Mr. Steel increased the energy stored on his quad in his battery by 27% when he switched to 4S to 6S. Consequently, he gets a lot more flight time, and that shouldn't be a surprise when we do the math, right? So if he was getting approximately 3 minutes, now he should be getting a lot closer to 4 minutes flight time. Lastly, the apples to apples comparison of a 4S 1300 to a 6S 1300 is not apples to apples at all, because the equivalent 4S is actually a 1950 milliamp hour battery. And compared to a 1300 4S, that is an increase of 50% in terms of energy stored. So if you are making this apples to apples comparison like someone in the comments of my last video did, they experienced a huge increase in flight time because it's not apples to apples at all. There is a huge increase, 50%. So if you were flying for 3 minutes on a 1300 4S, now all of a sudden you're flying for 4.5 minutes on a 1300 6S, all else being equal. Hopefully this shows you guys that it's not the cell count that is giving people the longer flight times on 6S. The stored energy is higher because the most common 6S batteries are 1000 milliamp hours or above. And even at 1000 milliamp hours, you're already getting a 15% increase in energy stored compared to the most common 4S battery, which is the 4S 1300, like I have right here. And when it comes to battery longevity, well, you're getting longer flight times on these bigger 6S batteries with more watt hours. So in turn, you're putting less stress on the battery. And it makes total sense that you're going to be getting a lot more cycles out of your battery if you're putting less stress on it and getting longer flight times. So basically, even if the power demand is the same, because the capacity is greater, you're going to get longer flight times, and the power draw compared to the stored energy is actually lower for these larger batteries. So once again, it makes total sense that you're going to get more cycles out of these larger 6S batteries compared to a 4S 1300. So now that we've cleared up the claims about flight time and battery longevity, let's talk about current draw. So a very basic claim that some people make is that 6S is better and more efficient because it has a lower current draw. Once again, this is very similar to confusing milliamp hours and watt hours. The confusion here is with current and power draw. So very basic equation is P equals IV. Power equals current times voltage. If you're going from 4S to 6S, you are increasing the voltage. If power is held constant, that means that the current will decrease. So you're still pulling the same amount of power, but at a lower current and a higher voltage. So just because you're pulling less current doesn't mean that the quad is more efficient. And once again, in my previous video, we found that there are no significant efficiency differences between 4S and 6S using real data. So this is just a very basic misconception, but there is another argument that people make, and that is that with 6S, because the voltage is higher, the current is lower, which is correct, and that leads to a lot less power loss through the wiring, which gives you better flight time, better efficiency. And another form of this power equation, which can be applied to power loss in a wire, is I squared R, which is current squared times the resistance of the wire. So if you can decrease current, you indeed will decrease the power loss through the wire. So to kind of get an idea of how much power we're saving, I've done some math to really see if this makes a significant difference and if this is a real reason why 6S is better. So what I've done is I have taken a look at an average quad and done some math to see how much power loss through the wires we are avoiding by going to this higher voltage and lower current. So The assumptions I'm making here are that the motor wires on the quad are 5 inches long and that they are 20 AWG. It is worth mentioning that higher end motors are typically 18 AWG, which is a little bit thicker. So I'm using 20 AWG to make it the worst case scenario for 4S. And I'm assuming a 4-inch battery wire of 14 AWG. Once again, this is kind of a worst case scenario because some people use 12 AWG on the battery wire, which is thicker. So you can see I just have some constants here. This is the resistance per unit length. The resistance of the battery wires is going to be the length, which is actually 4 inches plus 4 inches because the current has to go out of the battery and then back into the battery. We convert that to feet and then multiply it by the resistance per unit length for the battery wire, which is 14 AWG. And that gives us the battery wire resistance, which is 0.001683 ohms. Then for one set of motor wires, it is 5 inches to the motor and then 5 inches back. It is not more than that because only one phase of the motor is energized at a time. We convert that to feet and then multiply it by our resistance constant for 20 AWG wire, which is the size of our motor wires. And that gives us 0.008458 ohms. And that is for one set of motor wires. So the power loss of all of the wiring is this equation right here. So it's the total current squared times the resistance of the battery wire, which we solve for up here, because all of the current goes through the battery wires. And then it is a quarter of the battery current squared times the resistance of one set of motor wires. So without the 4, that is the power loss from one set of motor wires. And then since there are 4 motors, we multiply that expression by 4. And then this whole expression is the entire power loss due to all of the wiring in this theoretical quad. So I'm assuming at full throttle, your quad is pulling 90 amps on the OSD, which is the same current that's coming right out of the battery. And at 4S, that is equivalent to 1332 watts, which by the way is almost 2 horsepower. And the power loss from the wire, we find just by plugging in for I and R, which equates to about 31 watts is what we are losing through the wires. And that sounds like a significant amount, but you have to keep in mind that this is at full throttle at 1332 watts. So compared to the total wattage, we're only losing 2.3% of the power that is coming out of the battery. So what this means is if we went to infinite cells at an infinite voltage, we could only save a maximum of about 31 watts, which really isn't that much, but let's see how much we actually save on 6S. So on 6S, at the same full throttle wattage, the current is less because the voltage is higher, because P equals IV. So the current is reduced and we're going to lose less power through the wires. So once again, instead of 90, we're just plugging in 60 as our amperage, and that yields us a loss of only about 14 watts. So we indeed are losing less power with the higher voltage and lower current of a 6S battery. However, the change is only 1.3%, which is really not much at all. So this shows that for our specific application, the power loss through the wiring really isn't that much. And by going to a higher voltage, you're not going to save much power loss. And keep in mind that I did these calculations at what I am calling full throttle at very high amperages. So when you're just cruising around, the disparity between these percentages is going to be even smaller. On the other hand, if you are building a nuts quad that is pulling like 200 amps on 4S, then you could actually cut out a lot more loss because the disparity between these two percentages would be higher at a higher amperage. Okay, that is it for this video. As you can see, a lot of the claims surrounding 4S versus 6S simply aren't true. And I don't think this is because people in the community are trying to be deceitful. I just think it comes down to the fact that most people just don't have a deep enough understanding of physics and electronics and all of these electrical terms to make the right connections. So with that said, the only real advantage I am seeing with 6S is if you want more power. Because in the previous video, we saw that 6S does produce more power at full throttle, even with equivalent KVs. And we saw in the last calculation of this video, if the amp draw is getting really out of hand on a lower cell count, then there may be some significant gains you can make in terms of reducing the power losses due to wiring. But for your average quad, it doesn't really seem to matter. And if you are happy on 4S, then I don't really see a reason to switch to 6S. So with that said, if you enjoyed this video or learned something from this video, please make sure to give it a like. I put a lot of effort into the math and explanations. Let me know down in the comments of what you thought of these results and if you thought they were surprising. And if you enjoy this kind of content and want to see more, or you just want to support the channel, please make sure to get subscribed. Thanks for watching.